community, which is a critical question that we're all trying to figure out and think about together. So the format will be that Professor Brown will open up with some remarks, and then there'll be a lot of time for discussion and conversation. So before we invite Professor Jonathan Brown to offer some remarks, I also want to show you his latest book. It's a nice, small, easy to read book, cheap, accessible, unlike many of the other academic books that he's written, which are very difficult to read and expensive. And it's called Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction. And it's about the life and some of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it's part of the very short introduction, a very short introduction to a lot of things. So it's part of that series. So please do buy a copy. Yasin, you want to say a few words about Kalam Cafe and what we do here?
Yeah, I just wanted to welcome everyone to Kalam Cafe. For those of you who don't know, Kalam means speech or talk in Arabic. And it's basically an event that the Muslim Student Association puts out every week to promote dialogue, to engage students with the difficult issues that are going on in the world and how that relates to Islam. And it's an event that's open to community members, to non-Muslims, Muslims. So I hope that you all come out to more. Thanks.
Great. Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Greetings. Assalamu alaikum. Is this working? Is this thing on? Yes.
Can you guys hear him in the back?
No. Yes. No? Still not?
There's a couple of seats up here.
If you're having a hard time hearing him, there's a lot of seats up front. There's some seats up front here. There's some seats in the second row. It'll be easier to hear if you come closer. So please feel free to.
I'm not good with this. I'm just going to break it. No, I mean, it doesn't bother me. It depends if there's feedback. It destroys people's eardrums. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. When Suhaib told me about this event, I tried to think about what would be a useful topic, but also something that I've been thinking about myself since, as maybe typical for academics, it's very difficult for me to get out of whatever preoccupation has been obsessing me lately and think about things more broadly. So I hope the topic will be useful for you. It's certainly something I think a lot about. And thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks to Princeton University. And it's a very accommodating and well-established religion and life program. Is that what it's called? Religious life. Kind of dimension of campus life. So, I guess the question I'll try not to talk for too long, but that's dangerous. My mouth is fairly large. My ego even larger. So I'll try to keep them both in check. The question I want to pose to you and to myself is, who tells you who you are? Who tells you who you are? And this is something, it's funny how the things that we hear in our lives at different times come back to us later in circumstances we might not expect. When I was in high school, a famous civil rights activist named Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who I think is since deceased, came and spoke to my high school. And one of the questions, he talked about issues of patriotism, issues of criticizing the government of your country, in this case the United States, and what do you do when you feel that there's things in your country that are wrong that you need to correct or help correct? And the first question he said we should ask ourselves is, who tells you who you are? And I remember thinking about that recently. But I think when it comes to Muslims in their personal lives as Muslims, when you think about the question, who tells you who you are, you might rephrase it, if you're thinking more academically, about what are the sources of truth for you? What are the sources of norms for you? Why do you dress the way you do? Why do you have the haircut you do? Why do you act the way you do? Why do you eat the way you do, drink the way you do? What determines your behavior, your ethics, your values? I'd say that in my own life, the default setting for my behavior and my ethics is the ones I grew up with, which were not Muslim ones. They were American ones. I'm not really sure what that means. But I think, and I wonder, for how many Muslims in this country, their values, their behavior, their norms are essentially those of the society around them. Now, the reason I thought about that is that a few months ago I was in India, and I went to this village a bit north of Delhi, about 3 hours north of Delhi, called Kandla. Kandla is a very famous village. It's produced, now it's more of a town, produced a number of very famous scholars from India. And I went to the house of a famous scholar there to meet with him. And driving through the village, I saw pigs everywhere. I mean, huge pigs. I don't know how many of you have seen pigs before. I mean, I've seen big pigs, but these were huge pigs. They could knock me over, eat me, kill me, do whatever they wanted. And they were everywhere. And I was surprised about this, because I thought maybe this town has probably a fairly large Muslim population, maybe 20-30% Muslim population. And in America you don't see pigs wandering around, and generally there's concern for religious minorities and their sensibilities. That surprised me, and I went into his house and met with him and his family and ate with him, and I saw everything he did, everything his family did was based on the Sunnah. I mean, really, the way they ate, the way they dressed, the way they touched their plates. They lived so consciously by the Sunnah of the Prophet. And it made me think about what it took for Muslims to live in the surroundings that were predominantly non-Muslim for centuries. And how do you establish your identity? How do you preserve your identity in a setting, cultural, political setting that doesn't necessarily agree with you, and is certainly in which you're a minority? And you really have to ask yourself at these moments where you get your values from. Where's the source of truth for you? Who's going to tell you who you are? For this family, the Sunnah told them who they were. And it made me sort of look at my own life and think about, to what extent was I really someone whose life was defined by his religion? To what extent was I really a Muslim? And to what extent was I just a white, upper middle class, educated male who happened to have certain beliefs, but whose life was otherwise essentially a continuation of his surroundings in which he grew up? It made me think a lot about that. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that, at least in urban, educated America, and I acknowledge very importantly that this is a diverse country and that there are many people in this country for whom this is not true, but I would say that for many people in certainly urban America, well-educated, upper middle class, religion is not supposed to be a dominant factor in your life. In general, the rules for our interaction with each other, whether it's on a daily basis, whether it's in our relationships, whether it's in our etiquette, they don't come from our religion. They come from social norms, whether we get them through movies or TV, or how we're educated in grade school, or from watching an excessive number of James Bond movies or something like that, like I did when I was a child. But religion isn't supposed to give you these things. Religion provides maybe some metaphysical framework for your life. It tells you, is there a God or not? What happens to you when you die? Basically, maybe a few vague values about being good and charitable, but otherwise, it's not really supposed to inform your daily life, in your interaction, and your values. And when, on those things that it is supposed to do, it bloody well better give you answers. Right? It doesn't give you answers. And if I actually sat and thought about it, I'd probably think of a number of movie quotes where, it's all about, I'm trying to find the answers. I couldn't, religion didn't give me the answers. God didn't give me the answers. I'm just imagining Bill Maher saying, come on, there are no answers out there. Everybody disagrees. And the whole premise here is that, religion's supposed to give you these answers about crucial questions, metaphysical questions. And if it fails to do that, if religion or God, whatever this thing out there that you're interacting with is, if it fails to give you the answers, then it's failed you, and it's not serving its appropriate role, and then arguably it may not actually exist or be real. And I think that when Muslims are confronted with that social reality, and then they look at their religion, sometimes I think it's confusing for them because they see actually a tremendous diversity of answers. They look at all the different kinds of Muslims they see in America. Let's say the different approaches to Islam. There's lovey-dovey Sufis, and there's goofy Sufis, and then there's middle-of-the-road Sufis, and then there's conservative Salafis, and there's really conservative Salafis. I'm using these terms facetiously. I don't actually call people this, but I'm just giving you an idea of maybe how people think. So there's so many answers, and they all seem to disagree with each other on important factors. And what I'm supposed to get answers from this religion, so why am I not getting one set of answers? Why is there more than one answer much of the time? And I think that I may be sort of answering some kind of straw man here, but I think that this is a source of doubt. I think this causes doubt from America, from Muslims here, because it makes them feel like their religion is not serving its function. And if it's not serving its function, then really, does it deserve to be there? Does it deserve to be followed? Now, I think it's important that we think about and we remember why the Sharia tradition began, what purpose it serves. And we know about Islamic law, we know about Islamic theology, we know about how you're supposed to step into the bathroom with your left foot and step out with your right foot, and you're supposed to say this when you go into the mosque, and you're supposed to say this when you meet a certain kind of person, and you're supposed to say that when you meet a certain kind of person, you're supposed to drink like this and eat like that. And we know about all these rules or suggestions, recommendations, but we have to remember why these things emerged. The purpose of the Sharia was to provide a unified vision in a world in which there was no unified vision. Okay, when Muslims expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula, by 650, the Muslims had crossed into Central Asia. By 711, they'd gone into, not the 711, the store, but the year 711. By 711, they'd gone into Andalusia in the west, and into the Sindh, Indus River Valley in the east. They were stretched over a territory that had never previously been unified under any one polity or any one group or any one vision. And they very intelligently looked around and saw that people really don't agree with each other on much. So how do you provide any kind of unified vision in this world, in this bigger world where Muslim scholars were supposed to guide people? How do you tell Muslims who are living now in Marv in Central Asia, and some living in North Africa, and some living in Egypt? How do you tell them how to think about values and God and what pleases God? So the Sharia tradition was supposed to create, it was almost a civilizational project. It was a civilizational project. It's supposed to create answers, give people answers. Now, Muslim scholars weren't concerned about competing notions of norms or values. Because in many cases, those systems of norms and values had disintegrated or were absent. And so, today when we think about Islamic law, we think about, well, in America we have a legal system. We have a state's legal system and a federal legal system and all sorts of other things. We have the norms, we have university regulations, we have general American urban norms for interaction with each other. And then maybe we carve out a little place in our life for our Islamic values and how Islam affects our life. It's a very small part of our life, or at least a very small part of our legal universe, our normative universe. When the Muslim scholars were articulating schools of law and the Sharia, they didn't have that. They didn't have that. And therefore there wasn't an anxiety about how do we justify this system of law or values in the face of competing ones, because they were providing infrastructure where none existed. And they also weren't concerned when there was more than one answer, because their attempt their project was to find a ruling, find some way of evaluating every conceivable action, every conceivable belief, every conceivable statement. They wanted to figure out, should a Muslim do this or not? What is the standing of this act or this belief in God's eyes? Does this please God or not? Excuse me. And they understood that this was a probabilistic enterprise. This was an enterprise where people were going to come to different answers. Two individuals, both with the same intention, the same good intentions, would look at the same sources and come up with the same Quranic verses or the same hadiths of the Prophet or the same understandings of the Sunnah of the Prophet, and come up with very different answers. And this wasn't a cause of anxiety because they didn't assume that there was just one truth on everything, that there was always one answer, because religion only gives you one answer. They understood that they were going to interpret these scriptures differently. But the important thing was they were providing answers for somebody. They were providing answers for their local population. They were providing answers for those who came and asked them questions. And they understood the diversity of the interpretations that they produced. They understood that there were people who completely disagreed with them in another region or even in the same city. But this didn't cause them anxiety because they knew they were all engaged in this common enterprise of providing answers for their population when there otherwise was not any kind of unified system of norms or laws. What the result is a system of laws and belief that has as its center, or at its center, certain unchanging core beliefs and values. Now, we can call these things, in general, they're called thawabit, things that are firm, plural of thabita, thawabit. Or sometimes they're called wa'ima min ad-din bid-durura, things that are known essentially as part of the religion. Things that are known essentially as part of the religion. And these things are very few. These things are very few. If you go back to scholars like Imam Shafi'i, he says that the things that people agree upon are the usul ad-din, laysa al-furu', the principles, the basic principles of the religion, not the details. Things like their 5 prayers a day. Things like zina is prohibited. Things like getting drunk is prohibited. Not just intoxicating beverages, because some people believed that certain intoxicating beverages were actually okay to drink as long as you didn't get drunk. Intoxication is prohibited. These are the basic things that everybody agrees on. And they might disagree on any number of interpretations. Things like there's only one God. Things like that Muhammad ﷺ is the last messenger of God. Right? Things like you can't say that God exists in this world. Things like you can't say that God, looks like a human being. Right? These are things that are thawabits. They don't change. They're agreed upon by all. And around these, you have sort of expanding outward in more and more diversity, more and more probabilistic, less certain sense, are al-mutaghayyirat, things that change. The details of inheritance law, the details of ethics, the details of how you're supposed to act towards people on the street, the details of how you're supposed to dress, the details of how you engage in transactions in the market, the details of exactly how you pray. Do you put your hands like this or like this or like this? Do you raise your hands in the middle of the prayer when you come up from the ruku or not? These are all things that are disputed and disagreed upon. And they coexist, and there's no problem with them. Now, how do we, but they're all based on a common aim. The common aim of these scholars, which is to answer the question of how do we live as Muslims? How do I live in a way that pleases God? Okay, now, what does this mean today for us? How do we know what the thawabits are? How do we know what these core beliefs in our religion are? Especially, or core values, especially in the light of the questions that are presented to us from within our religious communities, from outside, the criticism, let's say, of the authenticity of hadiths, the fact that sometimes we find hadiths or we find Quranic verses that seem to clash so clearly, so loudly with what we might consider either scientific realities. This doesn't really happen much. Or what happens more is clash with what are considered accepted norms in the West, in the modern world. Things that are seen as human rights, things that are seen as proper and correct and moral in our society, and grand Quranic verses or hadiths that seem to be barbaric or immoral in the eyes of many. How do we know what's the fixed and firm parts of our religion when we are presented with these kind of waves of objections, which cause, in turn, inside us, waves of doubt? I think here we have to remember that Islam as a religion is not a set of answers. It doesn't give you sure answers for everything in your life. It gives you a lot of options for many things in your life, and it gives you answers for a few things. And we need to remember what those thawabits, those things that are known essentially as part of the religion, are. And I discussed a few of those. We have to remember what the rules are, the basic rules are that Muslim scholars have followed in interpreting their religion, in reading the Quran, reading hadiths of the Prophet, and trying to figure out how to define the religion from these sources. Because if we remember what these rules are, it I think, solves a lot of these crises and helps answer some of the questions that are presented to us. First of all, are things that are known essentially as part of the religion, things you have to believe or do or not do as a Muslim, to be a Muslim. These things can only come from certain sources. But I mean, when I say certain, I don't mean certain sources and not others. I mean epistemologically certain sources, things that give you certainty. Islam is not a religion that's about believing a bunch of fables or rumors. Okay? The Quran is historically intact. Recently, a Princeton PhD graduate, we were talking about this earlier, Behnam Sadiqi, wrote a great article in which he actually edited and presented this text of one page of a Mus'haf, a copy of the Quran from Yemen, which is very early. It's from the time of Uthman, around the time that the Quran was actually promulgated. In fact, it's a page of a pre-Uthmanic Mus'haf. That means it's a Mus'haf that's not from before the Mus'haf of Uthman. And what he shows is, in this article, it's no different than the Uthmanic Mus'haf. The differences between it and the Uthmanic Mus'haf are no different between the different Uthmanic Mus'hafs that exist or that we have reports about. So, the Quran is historically certain. Whether you believe it's revelation or not is not my problem. This is something that everybody has to decide. But from a perspective of a historian, this thing goes back to the Prophet, has not changed since that time. This is historically certain for Muslims. There are some hadiths of the Prophet that are so widely reported, so omnipresent in every single source of law and ethics we have from going back to the beginning of Islam, that it's inconceivable that this was a forgery. There are certain customs that were passed on so comprehensively, so widely, like the prayer 5 times a day, that this is also epistemological certainty. This is certain knowledge. Now, these are the things you have to believe, you have to accept. Things that are not given to you by certainty, you don't have to accept. Okay, you don't have to accept. Now, you may be committing a sin by not accepting them. You may go way out on some weird limb. You may be called a heretic. You may be called a sinner by other Muslims. And they may have every right to call you that because you're maybe believing something that's very questionable. But as long as you're not rejecting one of these things that's known certainly as part of the religion, you can't be called an unbeliever. You can't be called an unbeliever. So I mean, the reason I'm telling you this is not because I'm encouraging you to adopt some bizarre understanding of Islam and say, it's okay, I'm still a believer. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that the way that Muslim scholars understood their religion was not something where you're either in or you're out. You have to accept all these principles and all this world that we're giving you, or else you're not really part of it. This is based on people who understood the notion of evidence, that evidence has to be convincing, that people don't just base their understanding of God and how they worship God and their values on something that they're told as a kid, or some book they're given and told that this is your religion. It has to be convincing evidence. And going back to scholars in the pre-modern period, I give you their names, but I don't want to bore you, or modern scholars. If someone comes and tells you a hadith, and you think it's really weird, and doesn't make sense to you, and you don't like it, it may in fact be something the Prophet said, alayhi salam. Okay? That's not the point. But you don't have to believe that. You don't have to believe it. Unless it's one of these massively transmitted, unquestioned hadith, which are already so much integrated into your religion that you would know the thing that this hadith taught you already. So what I'm trying to say is, if someone comes to you with some hadith that seems very confusing to you, there's no need for you to panic and say, oh my gosh, what do I do? If I accept it, then I don't know what it means. I don't understand it. I'm confused. I disagree with what it says. It seems to clash with something that seems more certain to me. It's okay to say I don't know about this, or it doesn't make sense to me. It's okay. This is not something that you're required to believe. You may then find out later that there's actually a perfectly reasonable explanation for this hadith, that in fact it's wise, that it adds to your understanding of the religion positively. Right, just an example of this is the hadith that says in Sahih Bukhari that says that women were created from bent rib of Adam, and if you try to straighten them out, you break them. So if you have to enjoy them as they are. And people get very offended by this hadith. Who's offended by it? Is anyone honest? Can be honest? You're offended by it. Okay, I applaud your honesty. People, Lord knows how many times I've been asked about this hadith. And I used to think, oh, this is really problematic. I don't know what to do about this. And then I was watching, I think it was some comedian, I can't remember, stand-up comedy. And this comedian started talking about how, women do this and men do that. And of course, every single stand-up comic, 20% of their act is based on, women answer the phone like this, and men answer the phone like that. And women treat this, it's so clear to us that women and men have different, modes of behaving or something like that. I don't know what the proper phrase is. Different patterns of behavior, okay? That may be societal, they may be hormonal, they may be genetic, I'm not sure, some combination thereof. And, when I thought about, before I got married, I was reading these, how to be a good husband, how to have your marriage work type books, Mars and Venus together forever. And because I wanted to be a good husband. And it kept saying, don't try and change your spouse. Don't try and change them. Don't try and solve your wife's problems. You're a man and you're going to try and be reasonable, and your wife is going to come and complain to you about something, and you're going to try and solve the problem, but don't do that. Actually, you should just listen to her, because she doesn't want you to solve her problem, she just wants you to listen. Like, okay, it's a good lesson. And then I thought about this, and what is a hadith saying? It's telling men, you are going to encounter things in your life with your wife or other women in your life, and you're going to say, this person is being extremely unreasonable. This person is غير مستقيم. Their aqlan, their mind is not straight. This is what, and I challenge anyone who's I challenge any man in the audience to tell me that they have not had this impression. I'm not trying to say it's a correct impression, because we've already determined that men and women have different modes of behavior, different maybe perspectives on the world, I'm not sure. I'm not saying which one is correct. I'm simply saying that men have this notion of reason, and sometimes they see that not applied elsewhere, and then they say this person is not being reasonable. And they can either try and force that person to be reasonable, and they will spend the night on the couch or somewhere else, or they will cause great misery to themselves and their family. Or they can say, I accept that this other person is thinking in a certain way, and I'm going to not try and change them. I'm going to accommodate them and take them as is. And this, I think in general, in my experience and from all the books I read, is probably a better course of action. So I thought to myself, this hadith is actually very good advice. And there's other people, I'm not the first, I later found out I was not the first person to come to this insight, unfortunately. I can't patent this and write my own hadith commentary. Other people like Junaid Ahmed Ghamidi have talked about this, and I think a number of other Muslim scholars have spoken about this interpretation already. So really, sometimes you object to something, and then you, at some other point, find that it makes sense. It makes great sense to you. But the point still stands, which is, just because you're Muslim doesn't mean you have to believe every single thing Muslims tell you, or every single thing someone tells you is part of your religion. Even if they say, hadith says this, say, well, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know how to process it. Thank you very much for your nasiha, for your advice, and, let's go our merry ways. The second thing, this is very important, is that individual Quranic verses, individual hadiths, always exist in a context. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ taught his religion for 23 years. Imagine all the things somebody says in 23 years. Imagine all the bizarre contexts they find themselves in, all the specific instructions they give to one person, all the general instructions they give to another, all the times they change rules for their community based on changing circumstances. You go back and you take one snippet of what they say and you try and look at it in isolation. It's going to be very difficult to understand. You have to look at it in the context of the larger scope of their teachings. The same thing with Quranic verses. And this is something that Muslim scholars knew from the very early period. Sometimes people get examples of this from Muslim scholars. They say, Imam al-Ghazali said this, or Ibn Taymiyyah said that. And I would always say to myself, well, al-Ghazali died in the 1100s. Ibn Taymiyyah died in the 1300s. By that time, they'd been able to figure out what was what. What about the early period? Well, actually, as far back as we have evidence, as far back as we have books that exist in the Islamic tradition, Muslim scholars understood this immediately. Right? So, just to give an example, the Quran says, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ. Mushriks, people who were polytheists, who believe in numerous gods, the pagan Arabs, people who don't follow, have a divine revealed religion, they are najas, they're filthy. They're filthy. We know the word najas because we have najasa and things like that, things that are ritually impure. That if you touch them or something, eat them, you have to, well, you shouldn't eat them, but I mean, if you touch them, you lose your ritual purity. You have to do wudu. This is very interesting. So these people, these non-Muslims, they're actually filthy. You touch them, you have to wash yourself. Now, that seems very clear. I mean, you read this verse and you say, well, I mean, I guess that's that. Seems clear to me. But that's not how Muslim scholars understood the verse. Because they looked at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and they saw that he was constantly shaking hands with non-Muslims. He was inviting Christians into the mosque when the delegation of Christians came from the city of Najran, which is on the border now between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. He let them come into the mosque, and he left, and the Muslims left, and he let them do their prayer in the mosque, and then after that he went back in. He let his relatives never became Muslim. And he touched them and was close to them. So we know from his own life that this verse can't possibly be taken literally. And that it has to be referring to their beliefs. It has to be referring to something other than the literal meaning. What could it be? Their beliefs are impure for Muslims. Their beliefs are problematic for Muslims, which is, guess what? Not surprising. Muslims think that people who have other beliefs are not on the right path. Just like Christians think that people who have other beliefs are not on the right path. This is completely expectable from anybody who believes they have the truth in a religious tradition to think that others may not be so close to that truth. So, we have to remember that any verse of the Quran or any hadith that you're presented with has to be interpreted within the greater context of the Prophet's teachings. So in that verse I gave you before, Muslim scholars later developed this principle of what's called taharat al-adami, the purity of human beings. Human beings are pure. A human being, their tears are not filthy. Their saliva is not ritually filthy. That's just by fact of being a human being. Right? And they understood that verse I mentioned before in light of that principle. So, those are some, I hope, pieces of constructive advice or reminders for Muslims today in the United States and elsewhere who are asking themselves, who tells you who you are? And I will be happy to discuss this or take questions or have tomatoes hurled at me, just not so hard. I don't know how you do that.
Great, thank you, Dr. Brown. In typical Princeton fashion, we'll have the first few questions go to university students, and then we'll open it up to the wider audience that is here. So maybe the first 2-3 questions.
You can ask me other questions too.
And you can ask other questions beyond the scope. For JJ, yeah.
How do you reconcile like all of the different, I guess, sects of Islam? How do you? Because when people come to you and ask you, so why is there Shiism and then all these different partitions of Islam? Then what do you answer to them? So then, like, what's the ultimate truth then? If all these people are kind of following a different path, but they're all claiming the same thing.
Well,
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, how do you explain the different sects in Islam? When someone comes and asks you, well, how are there different? There's Shiites and Sunnis, things like that. I mean, I would say to them that you have this moment. Muslims believe that there's this moment in history, the last moment in history, when God communicates with mankind through revelation, through a direct message sent to a messenger, a prophet. And it would be great if we could all have, online chat help with some prophet who, we had a question, we could just ask our smartphone to answer and directly communicate with the divine or something. That doesn't happen. Once the Prophet is gone. Once he dies in 632 of the Common Era, it's up to the Muslim community, it's up to those his followers to try and understand his message. And they disagree, not surprisingly. You know, people disagree on everything. They disagreed in part because they had different, they recalled different teachings in his life. So Shiites, what became, let's say, Imami Shiism, some people believe very clearly that he had made, that he wanted his family, especially his son-in-law and cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib, he wanted that Ali ibn Abi Talib was the person who was going to lead the community after him, not just politically, but more importantly, religiously. There was Ali ibn Abi Talib who understood the religion properly and who would teach it to others, who would lead the community in its understanding of what God wanted from them. And others said, you know, that's not clear to us. We don't think that's the case, that that's what he wanted. We think that there was no one person who was supposed to lead religiously. And right there you have a huge disagreement, politically and more importantly religiously. And then within that, okay, well I remember the Prophet said this. Yeah, well I remember he said that, but he also said this another time. And I think that my point, what I remember actually is the general rule, and what you're saying is the specific case, it's an exception. The other guy says, no, mine's the general rule, and your case is the specific exception. Now you've got more disagreement. It's completely natural. And I'd say that if there weren't disagreements, I mean, I'd say that there had been some kind of conspiracy or something. I mean, I don't see how there could not be disagreement. But I mean, all these people, as long as they agree with these fundamental things that are known essentially as part of the religion. Hey, Raj? Long time no see. You owe me encyclopedia entry. Sorry. You know, they all go to Hajj, and they all wear the same clothing in Hajj, and they all circle the same Kaaba, and greet each other as Muslims.
Yes.
So, what is the methodology to determine this thawabit? And the reason that I'm asking this question is, wherever you look in the Islamic world, there are certain small sects that behave so differently from the majority that the majority labels them as non-Muslim or non-believers, and they have major differences, right? I mean, some of them might not even pray as the majority of Muslims pray. Like they would interpret prayer in a very mystical way. Or some of them might not accept the fact that Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet. So do we accept these thawabit like democratically as it is, or what is the exact methodology to determine the thawabit?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question. It's a very good question. There is not an authoritative list that I know of that is the things that everybody agrees on as being the thawabit. But I would say that there are certain ones that are so widely agreed upon that those who disagree with them are considered by all others to have left the boundaries of Islam, the pale of Islam. So things like, if you say there are not 5 prayers a day, or you don't have to pray,
Yes.
or that it's actually okay to drink alcohol as much as you want, or that there's a prophet after the prophet. I mean, these things, you know, if you get the vast majority, 99.999% of Muslim scholars, whether they're Sunnis or Shiites or Kharijites or anything, if they all agree that these tentative faith is unacceptable, then in effect you've found something that someone who has violated one of the thawabit has left the community. So I mean, there's not, you know, Muslim scholars have a tendency to say that the things that are the Thawabit are what I think is the definition of the religion. You know, it's very similar to what their own personal practice is, but more often, I'd say, and I know this sounds kind of condescending, but I don't mean it to be so. You find a surprising maturity about people who are willing to say that, you know, other people, I completely disagree with them, but they are not saying anything that makes them an unbeliever. And they have not left these core principles. But there are certain things, and I mean things like saying there's another prophet, things like saying God is manifest in this world, things like saying that something that's one of these absolute core practices like prayer or fasting during Ramadan. You say you don't have to fast during Ramadan. Just no more, you know, no more fasting. Ramadan's finished. Then you have it left in this. So these are the type of really core things that define, I think, what it means to be Muslim.
So it's mostly consensus based.
It is consensus
So
based.
it's not like if we had like a big sect that would say, okay, you don't have to pray, and they were like 20%, 30% of the Muslim population, that
Yeah.
would still not make them right? So
I mean, this is a good point. You're saying, you know, what happens if 90% of Muslims suddenly decide that they don't have to pray anymore? There's a famous hadith. It says there will always be one community, one group of people, ظاهرين على الحق, standing on the truth. No one will harm them. Not any of those people who forsake them will harm them until God's command comes, till the end of time comes, the day of judgment. And of course, everybody thinks that they're this group. But I mean, the idea is that there'll be a time when everybody will turn against the religion. There'll be a time when the masses of Muslims go astray. But that doesn't make it right. And one of the rules, when I talked about the rules that kind of control understanding of the religion, one of the rules is that you can't contradict the evident meaning of a text, like the Quranic verse. You can't violate its evident meaning without some reason. So when I gave the example of that verse that says polytheists are filthy, why do we not take this verse literally? Because we have evidence from the life of the Prophet that says we shouldn't take it literally. There you go. Now let's say you have another verse which says, there are many, let's say, verses that say that there's only one God. Or it says that believing that Jesus is the Son of God is a serious sin. That God, the heavens and the earth just tremble at this statement of attributing a son to God. And we want to say, you know, this is really intolerant. This is not good. We need to try and get rid of this understanding. There's no evidence. I mean, you would not have any evidence from the tradition, the Islamic tradition, that suggests you can abandon the literal meaning of this verse. So, the fact that you can't break with these core texts of the Quran and the massively transmitted hadiths without some strong evidence from the Islamic tradition to do so, that controls, provides some structure to the boundaries of the community.
So this question was about kind of the earlier part of your talk when you mentioned culture and religion, and I wanted to ask you whether you believe that religion is something that can be sort of purified from a culture, or whether a culture can be used to aid in one's religious practice, or the values that they learn within their culture can be used to aid within someone's religious practice.
The question is, can religion be purified from culture, or can culture be used to aid religious practice? This is, I think, a question that I think a lot of American Muslims face because they learn about their religion and they look around them and they go to MSA in college and they see there's some Desis and some Arabs and some Africans and some Indonesians, and they all have different ways of thinking about their religion. They're different, not completely different, but they're different shades of difference. well, what's the religion? I mean, what's the Islamic part? Let's get rid of culture. Let's figure out just what Islam is, and let's all do that. And the funny thing is, I think, in my own life, not to be like self-involved, but in my own life, I think the whole reason I study what I study and do what I do is because I've always wanted to know, ever since I became Muslim, what do I have to do? What is religion, and what's the difference in religion and what the Syrian guy at Jummah was telling me, and then the Pakistani guy came with the next Jummah and told me to do this, and the Indonesian guy told me to do this, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do, so where is the religion and what's culture? And can you separate the two? And the fact that I'm still, now, how many years ago that was? 1997. Someone do the math on that. I'm still hard at work. I think there's no clear answer for this. But I would say that I don't think Islam was ever supposed to be divorced from culture. Because people can't function without culture is patterns of behavior. People can't interact with each other unless they have some patterns of behavior. And Islam is a religion. If you go read the Quran, you're not going to find rules for everything in your life. You're not even going to find how to pray. You're not going to find how to do the Ramadan fast. You will find very few rules, very few norms. If you look at hadiths, similarly you'll find that many areas of your life that are not going to be dictated there. So there has to be culture. And the fact that when the Quran talks about right and wrong, it doesn't say, there's right, there's wrong. It says there's ma'ruf and there's munkar. Ma'ruf is what's known or accepted. Munkar is what's unacceptable. And these are tied to the culture. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that whatever's ma'ruf wherever you are. Today in America, it's ma'ruf for guys to wear, to walk around with their shirts off and covered in like coconut oil and with tattoos all over their legs. And I see this kind of stuff. This is ma'ruf. So this is it's acceptable. I see this. So therefore, I can do this as a Muslim. It's ma'ruf for me to do keg stands. This is ma'ruf. So I will go and do keg stands as a Muslim. This is not, obviously, ma'ruf is tied to the understanding of the Quran and the teaching of Islam in the time of the Prophet. But there are, of course, these rulings change with time. Muslim scholars will say, going back to the Middle Ages, al-ahkam tataghayyar bi-zaman wal-makan wal-dhuruf wal-ashkhas wal-anzima. Rulings change according to time and place and person and situation. Now, not all rulings. There's no situation in which suddenly it's going to be okay for everyone to drink wine and to get drunk and to do keg stands. That's never going to happen. There's nothing anybody can ever do that will ever make it okay for Muslims to drink alcohol. Now, if you're out in the middle of the desert and suddenly you come upon this cooler of Corona, which has been miraculously dropped there by some Air Mexico flight flying overhead, you can drink the Corona and not have any guilt about it, because this is necessity. Similarly, if you come upon Joe's Pork Shack or Joe's Ribs and Bibs Pork Shack or something, you can order in the desert. You can order the full pork rib ensemble and eat without any guilt. This is a necessity. But there's nothing that's ever going to make pork illicit for others. There are things, however, that do change based on custom, like how you buy and sell things. In general, Muslims are not supposed to buy things that don't exist. You can't buy and sell things that don't exist. Like I can't say, I'm going to sell you a camel that's not born yet. Sorry for the camel stereotype, but this is actually. But sometimes you may find yourself in a culture where it's quite acceptable to buy and sell things like on order. I'm going to buy. I go on the Land's End website and I order 5 Land's End shirts that don't exist yet because some person has not sewed them yet. But I pay for them. This is acceptable in the custom of our society. There's no doubt about this shirt getting delivered. And if it doesn't get delivered, I can very easily get my money back. So this ruling will change. Rulings that are based on, that are heavily interpreted, that aren't based on clear evidence from the Quran and Hadith, they can adjust according to time and place.
Mohammed?
So kind of as a follow up to that point, that I would think that the two ends of that spectrum though, in terms of the ability to really exchange integrations have in place. On one element you have pockets of the American Muslim community that has come to the table, or Islam in general as understood by our community, as saying like, okay, these are the rulings, those can't change. Perhaps on the other end you still have, because people say back like, okay, like that doesn't make sense, like that's kind of ridiculous that they can't change whatsoever. Individuals who might take that reasoning and apply it more generally, because the line between the two classes you just defined there, but especially for the lay population, I feel is hard to define and accept. When you have things that might be, according to scholarship, like this is so well defined in Quran and Hadith that like there's no way it could change. For the lay population, and especially given perhaps the fact, given how decentralized Islam is and then decentralized scholarship is in America, there's not that people like will turn to X resources in order to make those decisions for them. So they're trying to understand it for themselves, but that line is so hazy.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like how we move forward from that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this question of, you said the line is hazy between these two things, you know, things that change in time, place, circumstance, things that don't ever change. And the line is hazy. Yes, it is hazy. It's hazy in the middle, where as you get to the center of the spectrum. And that's the job of Muslim scholars. And you pointed out that, or you sort of implied, I think correctly, that American Muslims don't have this kind of resources to turn to. A lot of times they're kind of out on their own. But one, I think that there are a lot of scholars in this American Muslim community now, whether it's people like Hamza Yusuf, or Zaid Shaker, or Sherman Jackson, or Yasser Najjas, or others. I mean, there's a lot of scholars like Ingrid Mattson, former head of Islam, who can be turned to, and who have a lot of lectures on the internet or DVDs you can buy and listen to in your car and things like that. DVDs, I don't know, whatever people use, whatever the thing is people use nowadays. I don't know. So I think that the resources are much more even than when I first became Muslim, as I said, in 1997. So sometimes I think that maybe they don't want to consult scholars. That's, a lot of times American Muslims are, they're very educated, and they don't necessarily see that it's necessary to subject their very educated brain to the opinion of someone who, in their opinion, may not be as intelligent as them, maybe backwards. And sometimes those people are unintelligent, sometimes they are backwards. But then I think it's incumbent upon American Muslims to try and find someone who's not. They shouldn't. I think that it's very important that there's a principle in Islamic thought, yusadu an kulli ilmin ahad. Every science, you ask the people who know that science about it. You don't go to a gardener to get medical advice. You don't go to a doctor to get gardening advice unless you happen to also be a good gardener. And you shouldn't go to, it's not every Joe Schmo who knows how to understand the sources of a religion correctly. So you have to put in effort to find those people that you trust and you respect as a scholar.
We'll open up the discussion now, starting over here.
Yeah. Imagine, Islam has been translated to a matriarchal society, a feminist-friendly society. What aspects would be different? I mean, imagine you had to write that book. What would you write in that?
The question is, how would Islam be different if it was transmitted through a matriarchal society? Matriarchal, matrilinear, or matrilineal society?
Feminist-friendly, yeah.
Feminist-friendly
I
society?
mean, something like that. Like Sweden, Scandinavia.
Never been there. I think Arabia at the time of the Prophet was, I don't want to say it was feminist, but I mean, life of the Prophet, when you read Life of the Prophet in the early Islamic history, women were pretty active. I mean, they were pretty active in every sense. Commercially, politically, violently. I mean, I have a file somewhere of all the instances I've found of a woman bashing a man over the head with a tent pole and killing him, or sticking him with a tent pole. It happens very frequently. Or getting up in the middle of a khutbah and objecting something. So I mean, I'm not trying to, I don't want to do this thing where you say, you know, actually Islam was feminist. I'm not trying to say that. I'm simply saying that I really think it depends on how you define feminist society. I think that if you have a society that erases gender distinction, as some feminists would argue that that's the correct way to live is to erase gender as a distinction. You know, that makes it, why is gender any more distinguishing than, you know, whether or not someone has earlobes? Some people have earlobes, some people don't have earlobes. Why we don't define people's rights or pay or dress, or we dress based on earlobes. You know, Muslims don't, their religion makes it very clear that there are distinctions that are based on gender. There are distinctions about what your rights are and obligations are. There are distinctions about how you should interact with one another. And that can't be erased without erasing the religion. I mean, we can be very critical about how women are treated in many Muslim countries. We can be endlessly critical about that, justly and justifiably endlessly critical about that. I think we can also be endlessly critical about how women are treated in the United States. And I don't want to try and deflect. I'm not trying to deflect criticism from Muslim treatment of women. As I said, we can discuss that. But oftentimes the people who level those criticisms, the assumption is that, well, the way that women are treated in this country or in Sweden, this is actually the correct way. I mean, I look at, you know, I was talking to some of my students about this the other day. I mean, I look at why is it wrong for a woman to cover her hair? Why is that so wrong? But it's completely fine to say we have a culture where women are subjected to images. Or just looking on Jezebel, you can see this great story about touch-ups done to Victoria's Secret ads. I was not looking at the Victoria's Secret ads. I was fascinated because actually there was an article on H&M. H&M, the clothing store, was actually just computer generating the bodies of the models for the clothing. I mean, they look so real. You would never know they're computer generated. I mean, you have a society where women and men, by the way, are constantly bombarded by images of not just perfection, of like non-existent perfection. And then women drive themselves crazy and are miserable their whole lives trying to live up to that. And men are taught from a young age that it's their constitutional right to have a wife who looks like this. And the second your wife doesn't look like that, well, you're not happy anymore. And since me being happy is the only important thing, I need to go and cheat on my wife or something like that, or divorce her and get another wife who also won't look like that. So I mean, I guess my problem is the assumption, unspoken assumption behind a lot of these questions is that, you know, why can't Muslims be more like us? Well, I'd actually rather have my daughter dress modestly and not let men abuse her sexually or treat her badly. That they demand that she be respected as a person. I'd rather have that than have her go out and feel like she has to ruin her life and not eat and throw up in the bathroom so that her body can be something that it can never be, and be a miserable person because she's not attractive. I don't have a daughter like that. I'm just imagining. God, I mean, it terrifies me.
Yes.
Two questions. In reference to your before going to define whether it's neutral or not, Quran itself says there are two kinds of persons, Muhkam and Mutashabih. I wonder why you left that out and kept the other things. That's my first question. Second question. It's not problematic that there is a certain hadith found in the Bible. What is problematic case that Bukhari is reflected very nearly equal to one. It's called Sahih. And you said that Muslim scholars have been very honest from the very early days. Bukhari died in 256. We are living in 1920. For just 1,000 years, why has that analytic work stopped? Why didn't it continue so that the discussion has come out more logical? Those are my questions.
Okay, fair question. First question was why, when I mentioned the verse about polytheists being filthy, why did I not talk about the Quran's?
No, alongside that.
I mean, I brought up the hadiths instead of referring to other Quranic verses that, provide more concrete explanations of, let's say, human value or something. Because that's when scholars talk about this verse, they don't associate it with another Quranic verse, they associate it with instances in the life of the Prophet. That's why. We could also talk about verses in the Quran where they understand it as not being literal due to other verses in the Quran. So that's just a function of the example. Second question is, why is it that Sunni Muslims treat this book of Al-Bukhari, which is a hadith collection, for those of you who don't know, written by a scholar, compiled by a scholar who died in 870 of the Common Era. And he says, you said that since that time, Muslims have just sort of said that this book is authentic and they haven't questioned it. That's not accurate, because Muslims questioned Bukhari's book from the second he wrote his book, and they continue to question it to this day. And I'm not even talking about non-Sunnis or modernists or people who, I'm talking about totally legitimate Sunni scholars have questioned the contents of that book since the day it was written. They continue to do so up to today's day. And people don't know that because, especially in the modern period, because Muslim scholars are so sensitive to the fact that hadiths are being criticized so widely in very invidious, trenchant ways. I mean, deep criticism goes to the root of the hadith tradition. They look at the books of Bukhari and Muslim as these kind of bastions that need to be defended. They don't want to. It's like it would be like airing dirty laundry. You don't want to air dirty laundry to people who are going to take advantage of that. So
that is what has caused the satanic forces. That is what has caused the satanic forces.
The book or the
phenomenon, the entire phenomenon, not just the Rushdie book.
What do you mean?
There was a book in India that was published, The Colorful Prophet, Nila Rasul. It was all collection of hadiths from Bukhari and Muslim. And the guy was killed by an 18-year-old, and the British hanged him for murder. And he was celebrated.
That's interesting. Where's the deal? It should go in your dissertation. Wait, when did this happen? I didn't know about this.
Early 1900s.
Fascinating. I would love to.
I am surprised that you don't know it.
I don't know a lot of things. I don't even know where I'm parked. The point is I think this your example, what you said proves my point. Okay. People criticize Bukhari's book, right, left, and center, for many centuries. And then, surprise, surprise, the Muslims in India in the early 1900s are living under British colonial occupation. A few decades past a rebellion in which both sides were subjected to and carried out brutalities on the other, but in which it became eminently clear that Muslims were in no way able to control their lives militarily and politically in the subcontinent. They were living, some Muslim scholars said, even in non-Muslim, they were living in Dar al-Harb, non-Muslim now, right? And a lot of Muslims were saying we need to be just like the British because that's the only way we're going to survive. And other Muslims were saying, no, we can't. We need to keep being like we are now. We need to keep being real Muslims. it's not surprising that in these kind of extremely tense situations, in which what it means to be Muslim is being contested so fundamentally, that surprise, surprise, somebody comes out and criticizes something, or even says something that 100 years ago previous had been no problem, is killed for that. It's because it's not about the book. It's about what the book means. It's about authentic Islam being threatened. Now, obviously, I don't agree with that, what that person did, killing the author. I don't think that's Islamically
He is
acceptable.
celebrated.
Oh.
Even today, in poetry, he is celebrated.
That's very interesting. I'm eager to hear this. But I mean, this is oftentimes when you
My point is,
yeah.
if we had been working analytically with Bukhari Muslim all along,
That's not
this
true, though. I'm sorry, but that's
situation
not. We have to. Let's think about this. They were working analytically. What happened with this guy has nothing to do with Muslim scholars. There's nothing to do with whether or not Muslim scholars are critical. It has to do with the fact that Muslims are being, in this case, they've lost political, religious, cultural control of their lives, and the very definition of what it means to be Muslim is being threatened on a daily basis. And in that situation, I mean, a couple of years ago, and if anyone, I've been trying to find the name of this author, so please, if anyone knows it, tell me. A couple of years ago in Egypt, a journalist wrote an article in a newspaper, in a journal in Egypt, that the Prophet, he just mentioned the Prophet was not born circumcised. Okay? So, he said the Prophet was not born circumcised. He was so heavily attacked. I think he was dismissed from his position. It was really important. Now, you look in the medieval period, and Muslims they don't care if someone says he's circumcised, born circumcised, or not born circumcised. In fact, the majority, the best opinion, I think, is that he was not born circumcised. He was born regularly with a foreskin, and he was circumcised, as according to Arab custom. This wasn't a big disagreement. Okay, one or the other, not a big deal. Suddenly you take this in the context of a world where people are attacking Islam, attacking the Prophet, Muslims feel besieged, their identity is besieged, their religion is being disrespected, and I don't even need to go into the example of his movie and all the other things we know very well. But suddenly something that had no consequence 200 years earlier becomes life and death. And that has nothing to do with Muslim scholars, it has to do with cultural, political, societal challenges that are beyond any one individual's control.
Very interesting conversation. Let me make 2-3 quick comments, and then I'll come to the question. First, I think this interesting last conversation we had, I personally think it's not the problem with the hadith, whether you take the 6 books of the Sunnis or the 6 books of the Shia. I don't even think it's a problem with the criticism of hadith. I think the problem is when some people take hadith, which is, shall we say, not consistent or not directly in line with Quran, and then turn it around and say, this is the religion and you must believe it because if you won't, you are not. So my way has always been that if this is a hadith you like and you appreciate, by all means follow it. You want to have your women in a tent, put them in a tent. But don't come and tell me that I need to put my woman in the tent. And that's the difference, the way I look at it. Because, and I think that's where the Muslims have failed. It's not the criticism of I was reading some of your writings, it's not the isnad, and it's not the matan that's a problem. It is the imposition of hadith which may not be consistent with Quran. So then jumping to the other question that was raised, and I think this is where, which you are also alluding to, that any time a community is under siege, they tend to rally. That's why Hasidic Jews, when they think that they are under constraint, they can walk around Brooklyn wearing an overcoat in 100 degrees heat. And it's consistent because that's how they feel that they need to adhere strongly to their own tradition. And Muslims, in the big example that you had in the beginning, that's how they wind up. And then moving to the conversation, I'm jumping to the comments because I want to get them out of my system. We all need that. The comment on the, Muslims thinking that this is the right way of doing it and they're a minority and they want to pray their own way, etc. We have an example of that, and that was in Pakistan, where the Ahmadis decided they were going to have their own prophet. And they were splitting hairs on the definition of prophet of Khatmun Nubuwwat. I mean, they just wound up into this whole nonsensical conversation of saying, well, this is what Khatmun Nubuwwat means. And in that whole process, what the majority wound up doing was wrong, but was consistently correct the way you were saying, that you actually have walked out of the faith by your own act, because that's how you have led yourself into it. So now my question, in back to your writings where you have been studying the process of Isnad and Matan, and you were just discussing briefly about it also, there was a consistent discussion and criticism of Matan. Share with us, or at least for my benefit, what really jumps out in your study where you find that this discussion about Matan or this criticism about Matan, because that is how I look at it also. If the Matan is not consistent with Quran, I have respect for the Hadith, but I am not saying I'm obligated to follow it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what jumps out to me about the way that Muslims, so the gentleman's asking about Muslims criticizing, looking at hadiths, and they see the meaning of the hadith and they feel that it's problematic or contradicts the Quran or contradicts reason or contradicts empirical reality, and then do they reject the hadith or not? And I think that in general they were very hesitant to do that. And I think that Muslim scholars have been unfairly criticized for that. And people look back and say, oh, these people are so irrational, they're these slaves to narration, they're uncritical. But that's not why they didn't do that. Okay? This is the prophet speaking, supposedly. Okay? The prophet knows things that we don't know. The prophet knows what God wants. The prophet knows what can happen in the future if God tells him. And how do you criticize? Let's say someone says, this is attributed to the prophet. How do I, looking at the content of this hadith or this report, how do I use my judgment, which is actually less capable than his, to decide if this is something he said or not? Because let's say if I come and say to you, I just found a New York Times article written by this writer named, Harry Potter or something, that he's predicting that a couple years ago he predicted that some guy named Barack Obama was going to come and win the presidency. Now you'd say that's nonsense. Okay, this is obviously made up, someone forgery, because people don't know the future. But guess what? Prophets know the future. That's a problem with. So if the prophet says, "I've looked into hellfire and I saw that the majority of people in hellfire are women," which is authentic hadith, you can say, well, I don't like that very much. That's not fair. Why are there more women in hell than men? This is a sexist religion. But how the heck do you know who's in more, what percentage of people go to hellfire? There's no possible way you can know, or I can know. What we're acting on is this notion that we have now that women and men have to always be treated exactly the same. But guess what? I'm pretty sure that there's not equal number of men and women in the U.S. prison system. And unless you have exactly, I don't know how many human beings will have been alive by the time the world ends, but let's say 20 billion men and 20 billion women exactly. If there's 20 billion and one women and there's 20 billion men, then there's more women and men in hellfire. Unless you have exactly the same number, then there's going to be more of one than the other. So my point being is that Muslim scholars were always very aware that human reason is limited. Human reason is not just limited, it's always actually governed by custom. When we think about what we think is reasonable or unreasonable, this is based on our custom, based on what we know at the time. 100 years ago, we would have said it's ridiculous that someone could go up and float around the stars and and land something on another planet and go to the moon and walk around. Now it's normal. They say it's ridiculous that you could have little devices that transmit any information you want to you immediately, right? And so they were very cognizant of their limitations. Sometimes they did criticize the contents of hadiths when they found they just didn't make any sense to them. But a lot of times they were maybe just humble, and I think people should be more humble. I think that's a good lesson for everybody because, yes, Aslan.
Go ahead, Jack.
No, I'm.
Okay. My question is actually following up with your answer to the brother. At face value, then there seems to be a little bit of a contradiction between what you seem to have said earlier, which is you don't have to accept. For example, this bent bone example. How you were saying was problematic for you, so you were saying, even though you did say, I'm not suggesting go off on a tangent in the deen, but you were still saying, unless something is mutawatir, unless something has been part of the deen, or it's the Quran, you don't have to believe. So how do you then reconcile this? You don't have to believe it's good as the reason, but then again, the scholars were cognizant. So could you, I'm sure
Yeah, that's a good question, but thanks for asking that, because what I meant to say is, I would, myself as a scholar, I would things happen, things happen to you sometimes that are so insane, you tell other people, no one would ever believe this. I don't know, the time that Ron Paul handed me my coat in the airplane. That happened to me, and I say that, and people would be, that's ridiculous. Or other, like just the other day, I was walking on the street next to Donald Rumsfeld. Things like that. Weird things happen, and all sorts of coincidences. And tell other people, and they seem outlandish, but they happened. I would say that in general, it's better to recognize our limitations. However, we shouldn't go and act on, anytime someone says, oh boy, I just saw downtown they're giving away gold balloons in the Princeton court or something like that, you should go right now and drop everything you're doing and go do that. But I think it's important to maybe be more humble. Now, having said that, what I meant is that if you want to be humble, that's fine. If you don't, you don't have to. On these non-core things that are not absolutely certain historically. You're not required, if you want to say, I, Jonathan Brown, know everything in the world, and my brain and my sensibilities are the ultimate determinant of what's right and wrong in this universe, and therefore when you come and tell me something and I don't agree with it, I'm going to tell you to get stuffed. If I want to do that, I can do that as a Muslim, as long as I don't say it regarding something that is historically certain.
There is the criteria, the lack of certainty.
Well, both lack of certainty and lack of interpretive certainty. So something that is like the Quran is historically attested. There's no doubt about historical reliability of the Quran. There is, let's say, doubt about interpretation. So someone comes to me and says, polytheists are filthy. How can you have just hugged your mom? I'm Muslim. Historically, it's certain. The interpretation is not certain.
Okay, that actually
right?
helps me.
So unless someone can give you something that is both in its attestation, its attribution certain, and its interpretation certain, then you're not obliged to.
But you didn't mean to say, even if we had certainty as much as we can that this is a Sahih Hadith, and let's say the interpretation has been given, let's say in one way, I can't think of an example. You're not saying just because it's a Hadith, you don't have to accept it.
No, I am saying that. If someone comes and said this Hadith in Sahih Bukhari, and it's very clear in its meaning, you have to accept it. I can tell them no, I don't want it.
Even if you knew. That
Yeah, because it's not massively transmitted. It's just Sahih. It's not. I might be a sinner for doing this. I might be a heretic for doing this. I might be way off and doing something idiotic, but you can't say that I'm not
But you
Muslim.
can't also say God is three. I mean, you can't do anything.
No, you
want.
can't.
No. What I'm saying
because it depends. What I'm saying is, you can say it and still be Muslim. You can say anything you want in theory, I guess, but you might end up, Buddhist.
But then you did say I must be sinning.
Yeah, but sinning is not a problem. Sinning is just, committing bad deeds. It's not moving you outside the boundary of Islam.
You don't become a non-Muslim.
Okay, so you're basically saying that if
You can sin. I might, drink an entire bottle of
Yeah, I
Johnny
understand.
Walker Blue Label or something every night, and do God knows what else, and still be Muslim. As long as I
Okay,
don't
you're
say
talking about
it's allowed for me to
getting
drink
out
an
of
entire
Islam or
bottle.
not. That's
Yeah,
what you're
exactly.
talking about. Okay.
sin. That's a great takeaway. Like, keep in sin.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I mean just because I think we would like to walk away. By the way, I enjoyed your discussion. This is the first time I have attended or listened to you. Thank you for coming here. Very intellectual discussion. I guess this last point about the sinning part. I personally, I think I understand, but is everyone clear? I mean, I don't think he's saying we do not understand. I mean,
You might end up roasting in hellfire for eternity and have cirrhosis of the liver. But that doesn't mean you're not Muslim. Oh, well, actually, you wouldn't roast in hellfire for eternity. You would roast in hellfire until your sins have been burned off, and then you would exit hellfire and go to heaven as a monotheist, to be very clear. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a difference between making a mistake as a Muslim in your beliefs and making a mistake as a Muslim in action, on one hand, and saying someone's not a Muslim on the other hand. I think my point is that I think a lot of times Muslims feel that they're confronted by something about their religion that they're confused about, or they don't feel comfortable accepting. And they may be totally wrong in that reaction. They may be arrogant, and they may be motivated by all sorts of silly sensibilities. But as long as they're not rejecting something that's both certain in its attribution and certain in its interpretation, then they can't be said to have left the boundaries of other religion. I mean, you might disagree with them. You might say, "Buddy, you're really wrong. You're so far out there. I don't want to talk to you anymore." It doesn't mean.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay.
Thank you, Doctor, for coming in and addressing us today. And I just wanted to ask a question about what you just said. Is there a distinction made between not accepting it personally between you and God, or not accepting it and calling others also not to accept it? So, am I considered a sinner who will roast in hellfire for just a temporal amount of time, if I just keep it to myself? Or is that distinction made?
I mean, that's an interesting question, actually. I mean, like, let's say this is getting really into the weeds, but let's say you. What? No, I mean, let's take the Johnny Walker example. I mean, let's say you drink. In fact, you drink publicly. But you acknowledge, you say, this is a sin. I'm not supposed to do this. But well, yeah. Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking like rejecting a hadith or something?
I'm talking about rejecting it.
Okay, so let's say somebody, there's a hadith in Sahih Bukhari that talks about women, majority of women being in people in hellfire are women, and you disagree with this, and you start going around the country and speaking about how this is a backwards hadith, and the hadith tradition is problematic, and
let me give you an example. If you personally, and this is a personal example, there's the hadith in Bukhari where there's, highway robbers, right? And the Prophet is said to have caught them, cut off their hands and feet from opposite sides, and pierced their eyes.
And Origanin, hadith Origanin, right?
Right. So a hadith like that, even with Sahih Sanad, might not set well with someone, to say the least, Now, if I make a big deal about this and blog about it and call others to rejecting it, that's one thing. But if it's just between me and God, I say, I'm going to suspend judgment. I'm not going to reject it, but I'm just going to suspend judgment until I get a better appreciation or a better understanding. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario is I reject this. I don't accept this. I cannot reconcile this whatsoever. I don't accept it unless someone can convince me and of the authenticity of it in a way that I can appreciate. And that would be the third scenario. But I'm keeping all of this to myself, except in the first scenario, I'm blogging about it. So if you don't mind commenting on each of those scenarios.
Okay, I mean, I don't know if everyone heard the question. So you come across this hadith, it's in Sahih al-Bukhari, where these men come to the Prophet, they're actually sick. And he says, we could go to the camels, there's these camels, I'm sorry again, this is Arabia, they actually are camels around, so don't offend, not stereotype. So you go to these certain camels, the charity camels that are given to the charity tax. Go and get, they have certain medicinal properties, and then you'll be better. And instead, they go and they kill the shepherd and they steal the camels. The Prophet has them, when they're caught, he has them punished very severely, as their hands and feet cut off, their eyes poked out, basically. And this is an unusual punishment. And so Hisham was saying, what happens if you read this and you, I just can't accept this. I can't accept the Prophet would do this. One situation, you say, I don't believe this happened. And you keep it to yourself, whatever, I don't believe this happened. The other situation is, you start...
you suspend judgment.
You suspend judgment. Say, I don't know, maybe it's happened, who am I to judge, etc., etc. The third situation is, I really find this unacceptable, and I gotta talk to you about this. I gotta go and I gotta blog about this. I'm gonna try and change people's understanding, show people they can't read this and believe it. Now, and this is...
If you don't mind speaking about the sanad of this hadith before...
Well, I don't know the sanad. I mean, I know there's people have talked about it, but I don't recall any significant criticism. That's just I could be wrong.
It's in the Kutub as far as I know. It's in the Kutub.
Yeah, I mean,
it's what?
Yeah, so the question is, what happens? If you go out and start kind of blogging about this and you start an NGO designed to prevent people from being treated like this? What happens to you? Now, I'm not a mufti, but based on my knowledge, and I could be very wrong, you could think about it in two ways. One is that Muslim scholars historically, going back to the classical period until this day, they tend to say that if you're mocking the Prophet, let's say you don't believe a hadith, you start making fun of the Prophet, you start making fun of the hadith in a really disrespectful way that suggests that it's really kind of the Prophet and the idea of hadith and his sunnah, the Prophet's precedent altogether, you're mocking, this would make you not Muslim, because you're mocking the Prophet. You can't insult the Prophet. You cannot insult the Prophet. Okay? Now, however, if you are saying, how can we accept this hadith? We have a religion that says that, the human body is supposed to be respected. We have a religion that says you can't kill people in a way that is disproportionate to the crimes they've committed. We have I can give you all these great Islamic teachings from the Quran, the hadith, that show that this hadith really is not accurate. That's fine. I mean, now, many Muslim scholars know this. If you read the books of the Egyptian scholar Muhammad al-Ghazali, died in 1996, I'm just giving you as an example, because he really does this kind of stuff, the way he talks. He just gives you a hadith. He says, this is just ridiculous. Think about this. This can't be acceptable. I mean, how can we possibly accept this? Now, he's a Muslim scholar. He's a highly educated, accomplished, trained Muslim jurist. And he does this. Now, I think that is totally acceptable. It has always been totally acceptable. If your argument is if you're rhetorically demonstrating the absurdity of a hadith for the purpose of improving people's understanding, he might be wrong, but what he's doing is not illicit or something.
Or defending the Prophet.
Yeah, or defending the Prophet. Now, I guess the difference would be what happens if you're not a properly trained Muslim jurist, you're simply some know-it-all like me, who's sitting at home in his pajamas and angry about something. Then I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not a mufti, so I don't want to pronounce what this person's status would be. But what I'd say is that I don't think that that's problematic, because I think that this person is just doing an uneducated version of what Muhammad al-Ghazali was doing, what any number of Muslim scholars have done in the past. But I would probably, if I were to talk to this person, I would say, have you considered these other ways of understanding the hadith? Have you considered this and that? And try to maybe lead them to a better understanding. Maybe they're right. Maybe they make a convincing point.
Let me make that example.
Wait, hang on. There's other people. We have to be fair.
But the other two scenarios.
Everybody question?
The other two scenarios.
Rud? Yeah, go ahead, Rud.
Yeah. So.
And this kind of goes along with the answer to because it seems like based on the discussion that Islam does welcome interpretation and pluralism, but I feel like we've been talking about it as though it exists in vacuum. You discussed obviously that drop is the context of that, but I mean, there are real repercussions to these differing interpretations, and whether it is just a blocker, I mean, that, like, it really is never about, especially nowadays, I don't feel like it's ever just about that blogger seeing him and blog. I mean, he has an audience. Almost everyone nowadays can have an audience, just via social media and stuff, right? So, I just feel like how does the Muslim community like to reconcile all of these different interpretations, and like no one is able to say with certainty like this is the right way, but everyone is trying to say that. So,
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a sort of $64,000 question about. Well, if everyone's out there blogging, everyone has audience, everyone has equal voice, then how do you know who to listen to, and how do you control those people who are off mouth, spouting nonsense? Historically, there's always been people who spout nonsense, and you can try to educate them, but ultimately you can't do much about it.
everyone feels like they need to educate the other person to come onto their level.
Yeah, I mean it's a marketplace of ideas. It's a marketplace. I mean that's a fact of life. That's a fact of life in Islamic civilization. In fact, how does somebody follow one scholar and not another scholar? Because that one person convinces them that they should be followed, and another person doesn't. But the question is, how do I know? How do we prevent people from, or how do I know when someone is preaching something that is outlandish, maybe? And I would go back to this general rule, which is that you have the Quran, which you can access and read freely. You have any number of manageable collections of hadith. I don't recommend reading hadiths, by the way. I don't think people should read hadith collections. It's just not helpful for them. You can read books like the 40 hadiths of an-Nawawi. You can read small what? Riyadh al-Salihin, books that are created for normal people to read. If you read a big book of hadith, you're just going to be extremely confused. It'd be like trying to read the constitutional notes of the Constitutional Convention or something. It'd be very bizarre. But when someone's saying something that seems to break with what's clearly the evident meaning of Quranic verses, and the general understanding of the religion as it's been taught by the plurality of scholars throughout history, then you should be suspicious. Now, sometimes they might be correct. Sometimes Muslim scholars make mistakes, and they all make mistakes. I mean, they make mistakes en masse, not necessarily all of them, but there are gross errors in the way that, let's say, women are treated in mosques in South Asian Muslim communities. Okay, the fact that women are not space is not made for them in the mosque,